The cold October wind cut through his thin jacket like a knife. David pulled the collar tighter around his neck, but it didn't help much. The fabric was worn out, with small holes near the elbows that he'd tried to patch up with whatever he could find. His hands were shaking, but not from the cold. It was hunger. Real deep hunger that makes your stomach hurt and your head feel light. He stood across the street from a fancy restaurant called the Grand Rose. Through the large glass windows, he could see people laughing, eating, living a life that felt like it belonged to a different world, a world he used to know, a world that now seemed like a dream he once had. 5 years ago, David's life was completely different. He wasn't standing on a cold street corner with empty pockets and nowhere to go. 5 years ago, he was performing in concert halls, big ones, the kind where people wore their best clothes and paid good money just to hear him play the piano. He'd traveled to different cities, different countries even. People knew his name. They'd wait in line to get his autograph after shows. Critics wrote beautiful things about his performances in newspapers and magazines, but that was before the accident. It happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. David was driving home after a rehearsal, tired but happy. He was preparing for what was supposed to be the biggest concert of his career. Then, out of nowhere, a truck ran a red light. The crash was bad, really bad. When he woke up in the hospital 3 days later, his manager was sitting beside his bed with tears in her eyes. That's when he knew something terrible had happened. His hands. Both of them were badly injured. The doctors said he was lucky to be alive, but David didn't feel lucky. Not when they told him he might never play piano the same way again. The bones in his fingers were fractured in multiple places. Tendons were damaged. There were surgeries, physical therapy sessions that hurt so much he'd cry, and months of waiting to see if his hands would heal properly. The medical bills started piling up fast. Insurance covered some of it, but not enough. Not nearly enough. David had some savings, but they disappeared quickly. He had to cancel all his upcoming concerts. Without performances, there was no income. The classical music world is competitive and fast-moving. If you're not performing, you're forgotten. Other pianists took his spots. His name stopped appearing in programs. Phone calls from venues stopped coming. Then his marriage fell apart. His wife, Catherine, tried to stay supportive at first. She really did. But the stress, the money problems, and David's depression made everything harder. He wasn't the same person anymore. He'd sit for hours just staring at their piano, unable to bring himself to touch it. When he finally did try to play, his hands wouldn't cooperate. The music that came out was broken, wrong. He'd slam the keys in frustration and walk away. Catherine worked long hours trying to keep them afloat, but it wasn't enough. The arguments started. Small ones at first, then bigger ones. Money problems have a way of poisoning everything. One day she sat him down and said the words he'd been dreading. She couldn't do this anymore. She still cared about him, she said, but she couldn't watch him destroy himself. The divorce was quick and quiet. She kept the apartment because she could actually pay for it. David moved out with just a few bags of clothes and his memories. For a while, he stayed with his cousin in Brooklyn. But that arrangement couldn't last forever. His cousin had his own family, his own problems. David could see he was becoming a burden. So one night he packed his things and left. He didn't want to ask for help anymore. He was tired of seeing that look in people's eyes. That mixture of pity and relief when he'd finally leave. The streets became his new reality. He learned which shelters had space, which churches gave out free meals where it was safe to sleep. The other homeless people taught him things you don't learn anywhere else. How to stay warm when you have nothing, where the police won't bother you, which places throw out good food at the end of the day. It was a different kind of education, one he never imagined he'd need. During all this time, his hands slowly healed. The pain lessened. Movement came back gradually. By the 3rd year on the streets, his fingers could move almost like they used to. Almost. There were still moments of stiffness, little tremors when he was tired or cold, but the real damage wasn't physical anymore. It was mental. The confidence was gone. The belief that he could sit at a piano and make magic happen had vanished somewhere between the hospital bed and the homeless shelter. He hadn't touched a piano in over 2 years. He'd see them sometimes in hotel lobbies or shopping malls, and he'd walk past quickly. Looking at them hurt too much. They reminded him of everything he'd lost. Not just his career or his marriage, but himself. The person he used to be felt like someone else entirely. But tonight something was different. Maybe it was the hunger making him desperate. Maybe it was seeing that piano through the restaurant window. sitting there unused in the corner like an expensive decoration. It was a beautiful instrument, a grand piano that probably cost more than he used to make in a year. And nobody was playing it. It just sat there silent and abandoned, kind of like him. David had walked past the grand rows many times before. He'd never gone in. Why would he? Places like that weren't for people like him anymore. They were for the people he used to perform for, the ones who could afford $100 meals and bottles of wine that cost more than a car payment. But tonight, watching those people through the window, something stirred inside him. It wasn't hope exactly. It was more like a tiny spark of the person he used to be, trying to remind him that he was still in there somewhere. His hands felt different too, not stiff or painful, but restless. They wanted to move. They wanted to play. He checked his pockets, already knowing what he'd find. Nothing. Not a single dollar. He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, when he'd gotten half a sandwich from a church breakfast program. His stomach had moved past growling into a constant dull ache. The idea came to him slowly. It seemed crazy at first. Walk into a fancy restaurant looking like he did, asking to play their piano for food. They'd probably throw him out before he finished the sentence. But what did he have to lose? His dignity? That was already pretty beaten up. His pride? He'd left that behind somewhere around the second year of sleeping in shelters. David took a deep breath. The cold air filled his lungs. He looked down at his hands. They were dirty, the nails rough and broken, but they were his hands. The same hands that once brought audiences to tears. The same hands that could make a piano sing. Maybe they still could. He crossed the street, each step feeling heavier than the last. His heart was pounding hard in his chest. As he reached the restaurant door, he paused. Through the glass, he could see the warm golden light inside, hear the muffled sound of conversations and laughter, and there in the corner sat the piano, waiting. David pushed open the heavy door, and immediately the warmth hit his face. It felt almost painful after being in the cold for so long. The restaurant smelled incredible. Fresh bread, roasted meat, herbs he couldn't even name. His stomach twisted with hunger so sharp it almost made him dizzy. The inside was even fancier than it looked from outside. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting soft light everywhere. The tables had white cloth covers, real flowers in vases, and silverware that probably cost more than everything he owned. Well-dressed people sat at nearly every table, talking in low voices, wine glasses in their hands. A tall man in a perfectly pressed black suit stood at a wooden podium near the entrance. His name tag said manager in gold letters. He was looking down at a reservation book, running his finger down the page. When he glanced up and saw David, his expression changed instantly. His nose wrinkled slightly like he'd smelled something bad. David knew what he must look like. His jacket was stained and torn. His jeans had holes that weren't the fashionable kind. His shoes were held together with duct tape. His hair was messy and too long, and he hadn't been able to shower in 3 days. He didn't belong here, and everyone could see it. "Can I help you?" the manager asked, but his tone made it clear he wasn't actually interested in helping. He was already looking past David, probably hoping someone else would walk in and replace this uncomfortable situation. David's mouth felt dry. He almost turned around and left, but that piano in the corner caught his eye again. It was calling to him somehow. He cleared his throat. "I was wondering if I could play your piano," David said, his voice quieter than he intended, "in exchange for some food. I'm a pianist. A trained one, I mean. I can really play." For a moment, the manager just stared at him. Then he laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was the kind of laugh that makes you feel small and stupid. "You're serious?" the manager said, loud enough that people at nearby tables turned to look. "You want to play our piano?" "Yes, sir, I just need something to eat." "I can play anything you want. Classical music, jazz, whatever you prefer. I won't disturb anyone, I promise." The manager's face turned red. "This is a fine dining establishment, not a charity kitchen. We don't let homeless people wander in off the street and touch our instruments. That piano cost $40,000. A waiter who was passing by with a tray of drinks stopped and looked over. He was younger, maybe in his 20s, with slicked back hair and a smirk on his face. "What's going on, Robert?" "This gentleman," the manager said the word like it hurt him, "thinks he's going to play our piano for a sandwich." The waiter actually laughed out loud. "Oh man, that's rich. What's next? You gonna tell us you played at Carnegie Hall?" David's face burned with shame. He had played at Carnegie Hall twice, but saying that now would just make them laugh harder. "I'm trained," he said again, quieter this time. "I went to Juilliard. I've performed professionally." "Sure you have," the waiter said, shaking his head. "And I'm best friends with Beyoncé. Look, buddy, you need to leave before we call the cops." More people were staring now. David could feel their eyes on him. A woman at a nearby table whispered something to her husband, who glanced over with a mixture of disgust and curiosity. A couple near the window had their phones out, probably ready to record if something interesting happened. "Please," David said, and he hated how desperate he sounded. "I'm just asking for a chance, one song. If you don't like it, I'll leave immediately. I haven't eaten in 2 days." The manager's expression hardened. "That's not my problem. This is a business, not a soup kitchen. We have paying customers who expect a certain atmosphere. You being here is making people uncomfortable." "Robert's right," another voice chimed in. This was an older waiter carrying a bottle of expensive-looking wine. "We can't have this. What if all the homeless people in the city started coming in here asking to play instruments for food? Where would it end?" David felt his eyes getting hot. He wasn't going to cry. He refused to cry in front of these people. But it was hard. The humiliation was crushing. He'd gone from standing ovations to being treated like garbage on someone's shoe. "I'm not all homeless people," David said, his voice shaking now. "I'm just one person asking for one chance." "The answer is no," the manager said firmly. He stepped out from behind his podium and gestured toward the door. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave now. If you don't go voluntarily, I'll call security." As if on cue, a large man in a security uniform appeared from somewhere in the back. He was big, with thick arms and a serious face. He didn't look mean exactly, just businesslike. This was his job, removing problems from the restaurant. "Everything okay, Robert?" the security guard asked. "Just escorting this gentleman out," the manager said. The security guard moved toward David. Not aggressive, but definitely purposeful. David took a step back. This was it. He was about to be thrown out into the cold, still hungry, still invisible to the world. Another failure to add to the growing list. Some of the restaurant guests had stopped eating entirely, watching the scene unfold like it was dinner theater. One woman looked genuinely sorry for him, but she didn't say anything. Nobody ever did. It was easier to look away, to let someone else handle the uncomfortable situations. David's hands were shaking again, not from hunger this time, but from anger and shame and frustration all mixed together. He'd been stupid to come in here. Stupid to think that anything would be different. The world had made it very clear over the past few years that he didn't matter anymore, that his talent didn't matter, that everything he used to be was worthless now because of how he looked and where he slept. The manager crossed his arms, waiting for David to move toward the door. The young waiter was still smirking. A few customers had gone back to their meals, the entertainment over. The security guard stood ready to physically remove him if necessary. David turned to go. What else could he do? Fight them? Make a scene? That would just prove them right, that he was some kind of problem that needed to be dealt with. He took one step toward the door, then another. "Wait." The voice came from the back corner of the restaurant. It was a woman's voice, clear and strong despite sounding elderly. Everyone turned to look. An older lady was standing up from her table. She had to be in her 70s at least, with perfectly white hair pulled back in an elegant style. She wore a dark blue dress and a pearl necklace that caught the light. Everything about her screamed money and class and power. She was looking directly at David, and unlike everyone else in the restaurant, her eyes held no judgment. Just curiosity and something else, something that looked almost like recognition. "I said wait," she repeated, louder this time. She picked up her purse and walked toward them, her heels clicking on the marble floor. The entire restaurant had gone silent. The manager's face changed immediately. His stern expression melted into nervous politeness. "Mrs. Hartford, I'm so sorry about this disruption." "We're handling it." Mrs. Hartford ignored him completely. She walked right up to David and looked at him carefully, studying his face like she was trying to remember something important. "Young man," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "did you truly say you can play piano?" David looked at the woman standing in front of him. Mrs. Hartford, even her name sounded important. Up close, he could see her eyes were sharp and intelligent, the kind that didn't miss much. She was waiting for his answer, and somehow he knew she actually cared what he said. "Yes, ma'am. David said, his voice barely above a whisper. I can play? I really can. The manager stepped forward quickly, his face tight with worry. Mrs. Hartford, please, there's no need for you to involve yourself in this. We have policies about... She held up one hand and the manager stopped talking immediately. That's when David realized this woman wasn't just any customer. She had real power here, the kind of power that comes from money and respect and years of being someone people listen to. Robert, she said to the manager, her tone polite but leaving no room for argument. I come to this restaurant 3 times a week. I've been a loyal customer for 15 years now? Yes, ma'am, absolutely, and we value... Then you'll value my request, she interrupted smoothly. I want to hear this young man play. I'll take full responsibility. If he damages anything, I'll pay for it. If he causes any disruption, I'll cover the cost of every meal in this restaurant tonight. Fair enough? The manager's mouth opened and closed like a fish. He looked at David with pure hatred now, like this was somehow his fault. The young waiter who'd been laughing earlier wasn't smirking anymore. Even the security guard seemed uncertain about what to do. Mrs. Hartford, I really don't think this is appropriate. The manager tried again, but his voice had lost its confidence. I'm not asking for your opinion, Robert. I'm telling you what's going to happen. She turned to David. What's your name, son? David, ma'am. Well, David, I'm going to buy you dinner regardless of whether you can play a single note. But I'm curious. Something in your eyes tells me you're telling the truth about being a pianist. Am I right? David felt his throat tighten. When was the last time someone had looked at him like he was a real person, like his words actually meant something? Yes, ma'am. I trained at Juilliard. I performed professionally for years before things went wrong. She nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she'd suspected. Life has a way of knocking us down, doesn't it? Sometimes when we least expect it. She gestured toward the piano in the corner. That instrument has been sitting silent for months. The owner bought it to impress people, but nobody here actually plays it. Seems like a waste, doesn't it? Yes, ma'am, David said again. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Mrs. Hartford turned to address the entire restaurant. Her voice carried easily across the room. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption to your evening, but I'd like to invite you all to hear a performance. This young man is going to play for us. I promise it will be worth your time. The restaurant was completely silent. Some people looked annoyed. Others looked curious. A few still looked disgusted at David's appearance. But nobody argued with Mrs. Hartford, nobody dared to. The manager made one last attempt. Mrs. Hartford, our other guests, will survive 10 minutes of piano music, she finished for him. Now, unless you want to lose your best customer and deal with whatever review I might leave online, I suggest you let David play. The threat was delivered with a smile, but everyone heard it clearly. The manager's face went pale. He nodded stiffly and stepped back. Mrs. Hartford walked with David toward the piano. The security guard moved aside. The waiters watched with a mixture of anger and curiosity. Every eye in the restaurant followed them. When they reached the piano, David just stood there for a moment staring at it. It was beautiful. A Steinway, probably worth even more than the manager had said. The black surface was polished to a mirror shine. He could see his reflection in it and he looked away quickly. He didn't want to see what he'd become. Go on, Mrs. Hartford said gently. Sit down. Take your time. David's legs felt weak as he walked around the piano and pulled out the bench. The leather was soft and expensive. His dirty, worn-out clothes felt wrong against it. He positioned himself in front of the keys and for a moment he couldn't move. 3 years. It had been 3 years since he'd sat at a piano like this. 3 years since he'd felt keys under his fingers. What if his hands didn't work anymore? What if the injury had taken more than he realized? What if he sat here and made a fool of himself in front of everyone, proving the manager and that smirking waiter right? His hands hovered over the keys. They were shaking badly now. He could see the dirt under his fingernails, the rough calluses from manual labor and living on the streets. These weren't the hands of a concert pianist anymore. These were the hands of a homeless man. It's okay to be nervous, Mrs. Hartford said quietly, standing beside the piano. Even the greatest performers get nervous. Maybe especially them. David looked up at her. What if I can't do it? What if I've forgotten? She smiled. Then you've forgotten? But somehow I don't think you have. Music like yours, it doesn't just disappear. It's part of who you are. Something in her words reached him. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. Somewhere deep inside, beneath all the pain and loss and shame, there was still a pianist. There had to be, because without that, he didn't know who he was anymore. He let his fingers touch the keys. They felt cool and smooth, familiar despite the years. He pressed one key, then another. The sound was pure and perfect, filling the restaurant. It was almost painful how beautiful it sounded. Then he began to play. He chose Chopin, Nocturne in E-flat major. It was a piece his mother had loved back when she was still alive, back when things were simple and the future seemed full of promise. His fingers moved across the keys slowly at first, then with growing confidence. The muscle memory was still there. His hands remembered what to do even if his mind had doubts. The notes flowed out soft and gentle like a lullaby, but there was sadness in it too. All the pain of the last 3 years somehow poured into the music. Every loss, every night sleeping in the cold, every moment of feeling invisible and worthless. It all came out through his fingers. The restaurant had disappeared. It was just David and the piano now. Nothing else existed. His eyes were closed, tears leaking out from the corners, but he didn't care. This was who he was. This was who he'd always been underneath everything else that had happened. The notes rang out clear and true. His damaged hands, his broken spirit, none of it mattered in this moment. The music was perfect. It was real. It was honest in a way that words could never be. He played the sorrow of losing everything. He played the loneliness of being forgotten. But he also played hope. Tiny, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, he could still be something more than what the world saw when they looked at him. The final notes hung in the air, fading slowly into silence. David kept his eyes closed for a moment longer, not ready to face reality again, not ready to leave this space where he was still a musician, still someone who mattered. Then he heard it. Applause. Not polite, obligatory clapping. Real applause. Strong and genuine. He opened his eyes and looked around in shock. People were standing. Actually standing. The woman who'd looked sorry for him earlier had tears streaming down her face. The couple by the window had put down their phones and were clapping hard. Even some of the waiters were applauding, looking stunned. Mrs. Hartford was smiling, but her eyes were wet with tears too. She was clapping slowly, deliberately, her face full of something that looked like pride. The manager stood frozen by his podium, his mouth hanging open. The young waiter who'd mocked David looked pale and ashamed. The security guard was clapping too, shaking his head in amazement. David sat at the piano completely overwhelmed. He'd forgotten what this felt like. Being seen, being heard, being valued for what he could do rather than judged for how he looked. The applause continued for what felt like forever. David sat frozen at the piano, unable to process what was happening. His heart was racing and he realized he was crying. Not quiet tears anymore, but full sobs that shook his shoulders. All the emotions he'd been holding back for 3 years were pouring out at once. Mrs. Hartford moved closer and gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "That was extraordinary," she said softly so only he could hear. "Absolutely extraordinary." David wiped his face with his dirty sleeve, trying to pull himself together. "I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm crying like this." "Don't apologize," she said firmly. "You've earned every one of those tears." That performance was filled with more honesty than most pianists manage in a lifetime. Around them, the applause was finally starting to fade. People were sitting back down, but they were talking excitedly, looking at David with completely different eyes than before. The woman who'd been crying was still dabbing at her face with a napkin. An older gentleman at a corner table raised his wine glass toward David in a silent toast. The manager approached slowly, and David could see the conflict on his face. He clearly didn't want to admit he'd been wrong, but he also couldn't pretend he hadn't just witnessed something remarkable. "That was quite impressive," the manager said stiffly. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was the closest he could manage. "I suppose I may have been hasty in my judgment." Mrs. Hartford gave him a sharp look. "Hasty? Robert, you were cruel." "There's a difference." The manager's face flushed red. Several nearby diners were watching this exchange with interest. "Yes, well, I was simply protecting our establishment." "You were protecting your own small-mindedness," Mrs. Hartford interrupted. "But we can discuss that later. Right now, this young man needs food. He said he hasn't eaten in 2 days, and I intend to fix that immediately." She gestured to the young waiter who'd mocked David earlier. He came over reluctantly, unable to meet David's eyes. Yes, Mrs. Hartford? I want you to bring everything. Your best soup, your finest steak, fresh bread, vegetables, dessert. And don't you dare skimp on the portions. In fact, pack up extra for him to take with him. Understood? Yes, ma'am, the waiter mumbled. He glanced at David briefly, and there was genuine shame in his expression now. I'm sorry about what I said before. That was wrong of me. David nodded, not trusting himself to speak yet. The waiter hurried off toward the kitchen. Mrs. Hartford guided David to her table in the corner. It was set for one, with a half-eaten meal that had probably gone cold during his performance. She didn't seem to care. She pulled out a chair for him, treating him like an honored guest rather than someone who'd been about to get thrown out 10 minutes ago. As David sat down, his whole body felt shaky. The adrenaline from performing was wearing off, leaving him exhausted. Mrs. Hartford sat across from him, studying his face with those intelligent eyes. How long since you performed? She asked. 3 years, David said. Give or take a few months. I lost track of time after a while. And before that? You said you trained at Juilliard? David nodded. He found himself telling her everything. About his career, the concerts, the reviews that called him a rising star in classical music. About the accident that shattered his hands and his life. About the medical bills, the divorce, losing everything piece by piece until there was nothing left. About the shelters and the streets and learning to be invisible. Mrs. Hartford listened to all of it without interrupting. She didn't offer meaningless platitudes or tell him everything happens for a reason. She just listened, really listened in a way that made David feel human again. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I knew I recognized something in you. The way you held yourself, even in your circumstances, the look in your eyes when you saw that piano. I've spent 40 years around musicians, David. I know what real talent looks like even when it's been beaten down by life. 40 years, David asked. She smiled. I used to be on the board of the New York Philharmonic. My late husband was a conductor. I've heard the best pianists in the world perform. And what you just played? That belongs right up there with them. Maybe better than most because you've lived through things they can only imagine. Before David could respond, the waiter returned with the first course. It was French onion soup, the cheese still bubbling hot on top. The smell alone almost made David dizzy. Behind the waiter came another server with warm bread and butter. Go ahead, Mrs. Hartford said. Eat. We'll talk more after. David picked up the spoon with shaking hands. The first taste of that soup was almost overwhelming. Rich, savory, perfect. He forced himself to eat slowly, even though his body wanted to devour everything immediately. He'd learned the hard way that eating too fast after going hungry makes you sick. As he ate, Mrs. Hartford pulled out her phone. She was typing quickly, making calls in a low voice. David caught bits and pieces. Yes, you need to hear him. Tomorrow morning, I'm absolutely serious. Clear your schedule. The main course arrived. A perfect steak, cooked medium rare with roasted potatoes and asparagus. David couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten something this good. Maybe at his own wedding reception years ago. That felt like a different lifetime. Other diners kept glancing over at their table. A few came up to compliment his playing. One older man slipped a $20 bill into David's hand before walking away. A younger couple asked if he gave lessons. Each interaction felt surreal, like he'd stepped into an alternate version of his life. The manager appeared again, this time carrying a bottle of wine. Compliments of the house, he said, though he still couldn't quite look David in the eye. And I wanted to apologize properly. I judged you unfairly. It won't happen again. Mrs. Hartford accepted the wine, but her expression remained cool. See that it doesn't, Robert. This young man has more dignity in his little finger than most people have in their whole body. You'd do well to remember that appearances can be very deceiving. After the manager left, she poured wine for both of them. To new beginnings, she said, raising her glass. They clinked glasses, and David took a sip. It tasted expensive, though he'd lost his ability to tell good wine from bad somewhere along the way. Mrs. Hartford, David said, I don't know how to thank you, not just for the meal, but for seeing me, for giving me a chance when everyone else wanted me gone. She waved her hand dismissively. I'm not doing this out of charity, David. I'm doing this because talent like yours deserves to be heard, and because I have connections that can help you if you're willing to work hard. What do you mean? She leaned forward, her eyes bright with purpose. I made some calls while you were eating. I have a friend who runs a music therapy program at a community center in Brooklyn. They need someone to teach piano to underprivileged kids. It doesn't pay much, but it comes with a small apartment above the center. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and safe and warm. David's fork clattered onto his plate. You're serious? Completely. But that's just the start. I also called a friend who books talent for a hotel in Midtown. They've been looking for a pianist for their lobby bar. 3 nights a week, 4-hour shifts. That would give you steady income while you rebuild. David felt like he couldn't breathe. I don't understand. Why would you do all this for me? You don't even know me. Mrs. Hartford's expression softened. My husband died 5 years ago. He was the love of my life, and when he was gone, I lost myself for a while. I know what it's like to feel invisible, to feel like the world has moved on without you. A stranger helped me during that time, a young woman who worked at a coffee shop near my apartment. She noticed I came in every day and never talked to anyone. One day she just sat down at my table and started talking to me. Just simple conversation, nothing profound, but it reminded me that I was still here, still alive, still capable of connecting with people. She paused, taking a sip of her wine. I never got to properly thank that young woman. She moved away before I could. So now I help when I see someone who needs it. It's not charity, David, it's just people helping people. The way the world should work. David wiped his eyes again. The tears wouldn't stop coming today. I'll work hard, he promised. I won't let you down. I know you won't, but there's one condition. Anything. You have to believe you deserve this. Not just the job or the apartment, but a real life. A future. Can you do that? David thought about the question. 3 years of living on the streets had taught him to expect nothing, to want nothing, because wanting things only led to disappointment. But sitting here with a full stomach and people who'd applauded his playing, and a woman who believed in him for no reason except that she'd heard him play, maybe he could start believing again. I can try, he said. Mrs. Hartford smiled. That's all I'm asking. Now finish your meal. We have a lot of work to do. 6 months later, David stood backstage at a small concert hall in Manhattan. His hands were sweating and his heart was pounding just like it used to before performances. But this time was different. This time he wasn't afraid of failing. He was afraid of forgetting how far he'd come. The apartment above the community center had been tiny. Just one room with a bathroom and a small kitchenette. But it had a door that locked, a bed that was his, and heat that worked. That first night, David had laid on the bed fully clothed, unable to believe it was real. He'd woken up several times, convinced he'd be back on the street by morning. But morning came and he was still there. The job teaching piano to kids had started rough. The children at the community center came from difficult backgrounds. Some were dealing with poverty, others with family problems, a few with trauma that made it hard for them to trust anyone. David understood them in a way most teachers couldn't. He knew what it felt like to have the world treat you like you didn't matter. There was one girl, Sophia, who'd been particularly difficult at first. She was 12, angry at everything, and refused to even touch the piano keys for the first 2 weeks. She'd just sit there with her arms crossed, glaring at him. David hadn't pushed. He just played for her instead, letting the music do the talking. He played songs he thought she might like, mixed in with classical pieces. Sometimes he'd tell her stories about his own life while he played, about losing everything, about feeling like giving up, about that night at the restaurant when one person's kindness changed everything. Slowly, Sophia had started to soften. One day, she'd asked him to teach her a specific song she'd heard on the radio. It wasn't classical music, just a popular song, but David had taught her anyway. Once her fingers touched those keys and she heard the music she was creating, something changed. She started showing up early for lessons. She'd practice on her own time. 3 months later, she was playing pieces David had struggled with at her age. The hotel job had been good too. 3 nights a week, he'd play in the lobby bar from 6 to 10, mostly background music for people having drinks and conversations. But sometimes someone would stop and really listen. They'd pull up a chair closer to the piano. They'd request songs. They'd leave generous tips. David had saved every penny he could. He'd bought decent clothes from a thrift store, got a haircut, started looking like himself again, but more importantly, he'd started feeling like himself again. The music had healed something inside him that he'd thought was broken forever. Mrs. Hartford had stayed in touch the whole time. She'd come to the community center once a month to check on him. always bringing pastries for the kids. She'd shown up at the hotel bar a few times, sitting quietly in the corner with a glass of wine, just listening. She never made a big deal about what she'd done for him. She just treated him like a friend. Then 2 months ago, she'd approached him with a new idea. A benefit concert. Small venue, intimate setting. Half the proceeds would go to the community center's music program. The other half would go to a homeless shelter that helped people get back on their feet. And David would be the featured performer. He'd been terrified. Playing in a restaurant or a hotel lobby was one thing, but a real concert where people came specifically to hear him, that felt enormous. What if he froze? What if his hands gave out? What if everyone realized he wasn't as good as they thought? Mrs. Hartford had listened to all his fears, then said something he'd never forget. "David, you're not the same pianist you were 3 years ago. You're better. Because now you understand what the music means. You've lived through things that give depth to every note you play. Trust yourself." So here he was, waiting to go on stage. The concert hall only held about 200 people, but it was sold out. Mrs. Hartford had made sure of that. She'd called in favors, reached out to old contacts in the music world, and spread the word about the pianist who'd been homeless and was making a comeback. Through a gap in the curtain, David could see the audience filing in. He recognized some faces. Sophia was there with her mother, both dressed up for the occasion. Several of his other students had come, sitting together in a group, excited and nervous for their teacher. He saw some regular customers from the hotel bar. The manager from the Grand Rose was there too, sitting near the back, looking uncomfortable but present. And there in the front row sat Mrs. Hartford, wearing a deep purple dress and that same pearl necklace from the night they'd met. She was talking to the people around her, probably telling them David's story. She'd become something more than a benefactor over these months. She'd become family. A stage manager appeared beside him. "5 minutes, Mr. David. How are you feeling?" "Terrified," David admitted with a small laugh. The stage manager smiled. "That's how you know it matters. Break a leg out there." David walked to the edge of the stage, hidden behind the curtain. He could hear the audience settling in, the rustle of programs, the quiet conversations. He looked down at his hands. They were steady now, strong, ready. He thought about that night 6 months ago when he'd stood outside the Grand Rose, cold and hungry and desperate. He'd been ready to give up on himself, ready to believe that the world was right about him, that he was worthless, that his past achievements meant nothing. But one person had seen something different. One person had given him a chance when everyone else wanted him gone. And that chance had turned into this moment. The lights in the audience dimmed. The stage manager gave him a nod. It was time. David walked onto the stage and the applause started immediately. It was warm and welcoming, not the polite clapping you give someone you don't know. These people were here for him. They were rooting for him. He sat at the piano, a beautiful grand that had been tuned perfectly for tonight. He adjusted the bench, positioned his hands, and looked out at the audience. He could see Sophia leaning forward in her seat, her eyes wide. He could see Mrs. Hartford with her hands clasped together, smiling encouragingly. "Thank you all for coming," David said into the microphone beside the piano. His voice didn't shake. "6 months ago I was homeless. I'd lost my career, my home, my sense of who I was. I was invisible to most people. Just another person on the street that everyone walked past without seeing. The audience was completely silent, listening. But one person saw me, and that changed everything. So tonight I'm not just playing for myself. I'm playing for everyone who feels invisible. Everyone who's been knocked down and isn't sure they can get back up. Everyone who needs someone to believe in them." He turned to the piano and began to play. He'd chosen his program carefully. He started with the same Chopin piece he'd played that night at the restaurant. But this time it sounded different. There was still sadness in it, but there was also hope, triumph, gratitude. He moved through his set list, each piece telling part of his story. Rachmaninoff for the anger and frustration he'd felt, Debussy for the quiet moments of despair, Mozart for the joy of rediscovering himself, Beethoven for the strength it took to keep going. The audience didn't just listen. They lived the journey with him. David could feel it in the room, that electric connection between performer and listeners that makes music more than just notes on a page. When he played his final piece, he'd composed it himself over the past month. It was called Rising. It started low and slow, building gradually, growing stronger and more complex, until it ended in a powerful crescendo that left his hands flying across the keys and his heart soaring. The final note rang out, fading slowly into silence. Then the audience erupted. Everyone was on their feet, applauding, some wiping tears from their faces. Sophia was jumping up and down, clapping as hard as she could. Mrs. Hartford had tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling wider than David had ever seen. David stood and bowed, overwhelmed by the response. As the applause continued, he looked out at all these people who'd come to support him. Strangers who'd bought tickets to help a homeless shelter, students who believed in him. One elderly woman who'd seen potential where everyone else saw nothing. After the concert, there was a small reception. People wanted to talk to him, to shake his hand, to tell him how moved they were. A journalist from a local paper interviewed him. Someone from a record label gave him a business card and asked if he'd be interested in recording an album. The manager from the Grand Rose approached hesitantly. "That was incredible," he said, "and I wanted to apologize again, properly this time. I've thought about that night a lot. How wrong I was. How cruel. I'm truly sorry." David shook his hand. "Thank you for coming tonight. That means a lot. We'd love to have you play at the restaurant," the manager continued. "A regular spot whenever you're available. Proper payment, of course," David smiled. "I'll think about it." Later, after most people had left, David sat with Mrs. Hartford in the empty hall. They were both exhausted but happy. "You did it," she said simply. "We did it," David corrected. "I would never have gotten here without you." "You would have," she said firmly. "Maybe it would have taken longer. Maybe it would have happened differently. But talent like yours doesn't stay buried forever. I just helped dig a little faster." "Why me?" David asked. "You could have walked past that night just like everyone else usually did. Why did you stop?" Mrs. Hartford was quiet for a moment. "Because I saw myself in you. Not the homeless part, but the invisible part. After my husband died, I felt like I disappeared too. People saw a wealthy widow, but they didn't see me. The real me. When I looked at you that night, I saw someone who was still there. Still real. Even though everyone else looked right through you. I couldn't walk away from that." David felt tears welling up again. He seemed to cry a lot these days, but they were good tears now. Tears of gratitude and joy instead of despair. "What's next?" Mrs. Hartford asked. David thought about it. "Keep teaching. Keep playing. Maybe do more concerts, help more programs. I want to give other people the chance that you gave me." She nodded approvingly. "That's a good answer. The best revenge against a hard life is building a good one." As they left the concert hall together, David looked up at the night sky. It was the same sky he'd slept under when he had nowhere to go. But everything else had changed. He had changed. He'd learned that one moment of kindness could save a life. That talent mattered less than perseverance. That being invisible wasn't the same as being worthless. And that sometimes when you lose everything, you get the chance to rebuild yourself into something even stronger than before. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement from an earlier rain. David pulled his coat tighter, but this time he wasn't cold. This time he was going home.